The next item of business is a statement by Paul McLennan on Scottish Government response to the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Phase 2 report. The Minister will take questions at the end of his statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on the Minister. Up to 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am pleased to make a statement this afternoon setting out the Scottish Government's response to the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Phase 2 report. My statement today will provide an update to Parliament on a range of key actions that the Scottish Government will now take in response to the inquiry's recommendations to further strengthen the safety of Scotland's built environment. I will also provide an update on action we are taking to increase the pace and breadth of our work on cladding remediation. Presiding Officer, on the 14th of June 2017, a fire at Grenfell Tower in London resulted in the deaths of 72 people. This was a tragedy that should never have been able to happen. The exceptional work of the inquiry team is to be commended. The report into Phase 2 of the Grenfell Tower Inquiry was published on the 4th September 2024. The findings of the report expose feelings within the construction industry, the regulatory system and organisations that should have kept people safe. Whilst the fire occurred outside of Scotland, it has been felt deeply here. There is a shared construction industry where many of the same organisations, practices and products are used across the UK. Immediately after the tragedy occurred, the Scottish Government set up the Ministerial Working Group on Building and Fire Safety to consider how building in Scotland could be made safer and people would feel safe within their own homes. Much has been done to improve building safety since. The inquiry's second report made 50 recommendations covering government structures, building regulation, fire and rescue, civil contingencies, professional competence and product testing and regulation. Whilst the recommendations are mainly directed at the UK Government, 43 are in devolved areas of competence. I met last month with ministers from the UK Government, Welsh Government and the Northern Ireland Executive. We agreed to continue work collaboratively on building and fire safety matters. This is fundamental as areas such as construction products, regulation and professional regulation are reserved to Westminster. Government and industry in Scotland simply must be able to trust the testing and certification of products and the information that is presented by manufacturers. Disgracefully, the Grenfell tragedy exposed the dishonesty of manufacturers who put profit above safety in their homes. Our response to the inquiry has been published today, and whilst we have already delivered change, improvement and strengthening of systems, there is still much to do. We intend to deliver an ongoing programme of systematic improvement. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government will consult on the need for new legislation to strengthen the new standards building system. This includes introducing a compliance plan manager and changes to strengthen enforcement powers and sanctions. This builds on the established work of the Building Standards Futures Board. We will also ask the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service and Her Majesty's Service Inspectorate in Scotland to report to us on changes they have made to strengthen the effectiveness of their operational systems in response to the inquiry's recommendations. We will undertake a further campaign to highlight the action that can be taken to support vulnerable people to take appropriate action in the event of a fire. We will continue to engage with partners, including social landlords, in the longer-term options, including necessary legislative change to consider how to bring in regulatory requirements to carry out a personal-centred risk assessment. We will consult on the introduction of mandatory periodic fire risk assessments in specified multi-occupancy buildings to reduce the risk of fire. We will strengthen fire risk assessor competency in Scotland and the requirements for duty holders to hire a competent assessor. And we will work with local authorities and other Category 1 responders to review and refresh resilience guidance, training and practice. And of course, we will continue to work with the UK Government to strengthen construction products regulation and the regulation of fire engineers and fire risk assessors. We will also reset the Ministerial Working Group on Building and Fire Safety to oversee this work. Presiding Officer, as well as responding properly to the recommendations of the Grenfell Tower Inquiry, it is incumbent on Government to, of course, to tackle the problems of unsafe cladding. That is why today I am publishing a renewed plan of action on cladding remediation. This sets out the key actions we are taking, who we are working with, and how we plan to deliver a collective national effort. As a key element in this plan, we have launched today what we are calling the Single Open Call. This invites residential property owners or their representatives to notify us of their concerns about cladding in their properties. Having done so, and as long as the property meets some basic criteria of height and age, they will be able to apply for government funding for a statutory single building assessment. And further, the Scottish Government will fund all compliant applications for an SBA for eligible buildings up to an initial level of £10 million in the coming year. Assessment of this kind is a necessary first step towards ultimate remediation of a property's cladding. This initial funding will support a very substantial acceleration in addressing risks posed by cladding in Scotland. Importantly, this support will be available to the owners of all residential properties meeting these basic criteria, regardless of tenure type. That is, our support for assessment will extend to properties owned by local authorities and registered social landlords, as well as to privately owned properties. This investment is designed to reduce risk in the broadest range of properties as quick as possible. I should also make it clear that where a developer has accepted responsibility for the assessment and remediation of a property, it will remain for that developer to take forward and fund that work as is appropriate. The single open call is already open on the Scottish Government website, where owners can find further information and complete a simple expression of interest. Now, of course, assessment is just the first step in making a property safe. Responding to the findings of these single building assessments is the critical next step. I can therefore also announce today that a further stage of this open call process will be launched before the end of June this year. The second stage will extend the scheme to include potential support for mitigation and remediation works. Where a single building assessment has found that mitigation and/or remediation works are required to address the property's cladding issues, owners will be able to apply for government funding for those works. Information on the works will also be eligible for funding will also be published on the Scottish Government's website. At this mitigation and remediation stage, it is expected that a local authority or registered social landlord would be responsible as owners for taking forward and funding any work required. However, where social landlords are not in a financial position to be able to meet the costs of essential remediation works, the Scottish Government will consider the need for government support and will provide financial assistance subject to any ability to pay criteria. Once again, where a developer has accepted responsibility for the assessment and remediation of a property, it will again remain for that developer to take forward and fund that work. Now, of course, the owner-led model, envisaged by this single open call process, will complement the existing developer-led and government-led processes of assessment and remediation. We believe that this broad-based approach gives us the best chance of moving more quickly to addressing Scotland's cladding problems. We continue to make progress with both developer-led and Scottish Government-led remediation. We are finalising an agreement with the large developers on the developer remediation contract. This will enable them to take forward assessment and remediation of properties for which they have accepted responsibility. This follows intensive negotiations and the start of draft terms in September 2024, with significant progress made in agreement in principle of key terms. We are also working towards final agreement as soon as possible. We continue to work in partnership with the developers to support their efforts and track, gather and assure information on their remediation progress. And of course, we will continue to make progress in the government-led leg of this broad-based effort. As members will be aware, following our pilot programme, the Scottish Government is currently concluding the single building assessments for 13 properties and is about to commission assessments for a further 4. We will continue to support their assessment and remediation journey. Finally, we will continue to work with partners to gain as clear as possible picture of buildings at risk. We will use that information to make sure that properties at an elevated risk are being appropriately addressed, whether or not the owners have come forward through the single open process. We have already sought updated information from local authorities, asking them to provide an update on the situation in relation to cladding for each high-rise building in their ownership. Similarly, we have asked the Scottish Housing Regulator to provide information in connection with RSL-owned properties. Presiding Officer, I hope my announcements today will deliver a very substantial acceleration in the pace and breadth of assessment across Scotland, as a necessary step towards effective mitigation and, if required, remediation of affected properties across Scotland. We have the foundations of the Housing Cladding Remediation Scotland Act 2022 and the single building assessment process. It's now time to turn those strong foundations into real action. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. The Minister will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes for questions, after which we will move on to the next item of business. I'd be grateful if members who wish to put a question were to press their request to speak buttons now. And I call on Megan Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and to the Minister for advance sight of his statement. We are now 8 years on from the Grenfell tragedy. The Scottish Government have had 8 years to carry out remedial works to properties with unsafe cladding. Yet here we are with another statement and we're no further forward. I feel as though it's Groundhog Day in Holyrood. It's frankly embarrassing that the Scottish Government have only concluded the single building assessment process for 13 properties. Progress has been painfully slow, and there's been a distinct lack of leadership shown by the Scottish Government because we are miles behind our UK counterparts. This statement is riddled with next steps that should have been completed following the passing of the Cladding Bill last year. More consulting, more assessments, more information gathering and the resetting of the ministerial working group. But that leads to no further action. Today's announcement, Presiding Officer, is a kick in the teeth to those waiting for works to be carried out to their homes. What people want to know is when cladding will be removed from their property, not when the latest Scottish Government talking shop will next meet. The Grenfell Towers Inquiry's second report, published on the 4th of September last year, made 58 recommendations, 43 of those within devolved areas of competence. So does the Minister accept all 43 recommendations? When will the remediation works be completed on the 5 properties where work has started? And finally, when will the remaining 102 properties be completed? Because I feel as though it was a lifetime ago when the Government announced this in the first place.
Minister.
Can I thank the member for her question? I thought she would have welcomed this statement today. In discussions I've had with residents, some of the things that they mainly say to us is, "Look, we're just keen to move on with it as soon as possible." I think the single open call allows us to do that. Coming back to the point that she mentioned around about 8 years on, I've mentioned before around about the pace and said I would come back when we made a statement in January about trying to accelerate the pace. I think the actions we're taking today certainly do that. I think in terms of the work that I set out, which had happened since the fire, I think there's been extensive work being carried out where Scottish Government building safety standards people have picked it up and improved some of the areas that were there. I think I acknowledge the last debate we had around this, we need to accelerate the pace. These announcements today accelerate the pace, and that's coming from feedback from residents who told us. And that, in terms of the statements or dates that she mentioned, I'll come back to these particular points in writing to the member.
Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As Megan Gallagher said, it's almost 8 years since the Grenfell Tower fire. We're in a remarkable position where we've had more ministerial statements on cladding than we've had buildings remediated. Now, can I ask the Minister, on behalf of the residents who are still living in fear of building fires in their houses, how many buildings will be remediated by the end of this session of Parliament? What date is the Government setting for every building in Scotland being safe from combustible cladding? Why is Scotland so far behind the rest of the UK when it comes to remediation? And finally, will the Minister guarantee, as the UK Government is, that the companies responsible for the absolute tragedy at Grenfell will not be allowed access to any public contracts, and will he update procurement legislation to make that happen?
Minister.
Coming back to the point, I repeat the point I made around about today about accelerating the pace. I think there's a couple of important points in terms of this. I mentioned in the statement that we're concluding 13 building assessment processes. We're about to commission another 4. Obviously, single building assessment processes take a period of time. They're all different in that particular regard, as well as the completion mediation. If Mr Griffin has particular buildings he wants to come back to me, happy to come back to him on that particular point. I think in terms of the point he made around about procurement issues, this is obviously a reserved matter. This is something we've discussed very closely with the UK Government, and will continue to do that. We've got an inter-government meeting coming up where the ministers will be available to discuss that particular point. That legislation lies within the UK Government curtilage in terms of that, but we are working, they published a green paper, and officials and myself are working very closely with them on that particular point, because if there was any point that came out of the Grenfell inquiry, it was around about the products, the products commission and so on. We were working very closely with the UK Government on that particular point.
I call Jackie Dunbar to be followed by Graham Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Minister assure residents in buildings where no known developer is responsible for its upkeep that the Scottish Government's cladding remediation programme will not leave them behind, and that a single building assessment will take place?
Minister.
Yeah, I'm happy to give that assurance. Where no developer has taken responsibility for a relevant building affected by cladding, the owners of that property will be able to apply for a government-funded assessment through our single open call system. This is regardless of whether a building is privately owned, mixed tenure or social housing. The second stage of that scheme, to be launched by the end of June, will allow owners to apply for government support for necessary works based on the findings of that assessment.
Graham Simpson, to be followed by Ben McPherson.
So the owners' hotline that the Minister previously announced sounds like it's up and running now. People will be able to contact it if they've got concerns about their building. They might get an assessment done, then they might get help with work. We just don't know. Now, the Minister speaks about working at pace, but he can't tell us what that pace will be. Can I ask him this? £41.3 million was set aside last year for cladding remediation and £52.2 million this financial year. How much of that has been spent?
Minister.
I can come back to him on that particular point. And the other point that he mentions about in terms of the cladding remediation, the very purpose of the single open call today is to quicken that pace. When I've met residents, and I've met residents from across Scotland in terms of that, one of the key things they've fed back to me is in terms of can we just get this on with it as soon as possible. The single open call, I think, allows us to do that in terms of if it's buildings with residents associations and also factors. That's feedback we've also had from factors in terms of that. In terms of the point he's making around about when, and obviously one of the key points we're trying to do is accelerate that, so we'll be working in terms as quickly as possible around about single open call. If people come back to us, we will respond to them as quickly as we possibly can. The whole thing, again, working with registered social landlords and social housing providers is all to increase the breadth of that. So every single building assessment and mediation will be different, as he knows, as he well knows that that's the case. The purpose of the statement today is to accelerate the pace of that and the breadth of that.
Ben McPherson, to be followed by Richard Leonard.
I welcome today's statement, and the Minister knows many of the buildings affected in Scotland are in my constituency, and I appreciate both the challenge and the complexity and welcome this progress. However, there is a strong need to pick up the pace. And while I welcome the single open call, can the Minister state to Parliament how he will keep affected members and Parliament updated on the progress, and how will he engage with and communicate with those affected buildings, both the property factors, residents' associations, and keep developers to their commitments?
Minister.
Can I thank the member for his question and his dedication in working with his constituents around about this point. And I've also got my colleague CoCab Stewart and commend her for the work that she's carried out in that area as well. Our new scheme will accelerate progress in planning assessment and remediation by empowering owners, and I think that's the key word here, about empowering owners and provide appropriate financial support. We'll also continue to work with those developers who have already taken responsibility for assessing and mitigating risks in properties that they have built. Our regular newsletters and bespoke proactive communications will keep owners and residents updated. There's also a letter going out from myself to all MSPs today, and we've obviously notified committee as well as the statement around about both Grenfell and of cladding, and happy to do so on a regular basis going forward.
Richard Leonard, to be followed by Marie McNair.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's a basic human right that people feel safe in their own homes, and yet the awful facts are 40% of people with a disability who lived in Grenfell Tower died that night in 2017. A quarter of all children who lived there died in Grenfell Tower that night. To avoid a repeat of this tragedy, we need investment in not just building standards, but building control. Local council departments which deal with this have been decimated. So how does the Scottish Government intend to ensure that, in line with the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Phase 2 report recommendations, building control is properly resourced and supported to do its job?
Minister.
On the particular point on obviously the funding for that, obviously there's been an increase in government spending this year, increasing spending to local authorities by a considerable amount. So again, that's up to them in regard to where they spend. Our building department colleagues have been discussing this with them on a regular basis as they go forward, and we set up the Building Standards Future, the hub as well, in terms of listening to them in terms of what they're saying about that point, Mr Linden. Coming back to the point that he mentioned around about evacuation, I think we've been working very closely, and I mentioned in my speech around about person-centred risk assessment, and we've been working very closely with the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service around about that. And one of the key things, obviously, is communicating to residents around about that particular point. SFIRS also carry operational quality assurance visits to every high-rise domestic building in Scotland, checking features such as fire doors, lifts and stairs. So we're continuing to work with COSLA and with the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service on that particular point that he mentions.
Marie McNair, to be followed by Ariane Burgess.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Is the Minister able to provide an update on the work to establish a comprehensive cladding assurance register for Scotland as set out in the Cladding Remediation Act?
Minister.
Yeah, the Scottish Government budget for 25-26 provides £52.2 million in funding for the cladding remediation programme. So today we've announced an initial tranche of £10 million for assessment through a single open call scheme. I think in terms of, like any other owner for relevant property affected by cladding, local authorities can apply for support for assessment of properties through that scheme. And the point I'd made to Mr Leonard before, the Scottish Government has provided substantial and record funding of over £15.1 million for local authorities. That's an increase of £1.1 billion. So that funding empowers local authorities to address critical issues such as cladding remediation, ensuring the safety and well-being of residents.
Ariane Burgess, to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Presiding Officer, I'd like to start by extending my condolences to the family and friends of those who lost loved ones in the Grenfell Tower fire. It's a tragedy that should never have been allowed to happen. And when we discussed cladding in the Chamber last year, I highlighted that there was a skills shortage of qualified fire safety professionals. While the approach set out by the Minister today is welcome, I would ask him how the Scottish Government is working to ensure that existing skills gaps don't hold up works to make buildings safe.
Minister.
Yeah, can I thank the member for her question? I think it's a very valid point, and it's obviously been asked in committee as well, and it's been discussed here as well. One of the key things that we've been taking forward in our discussions with our UK Government and Welsh and Northern Irish Government colleagues was that particular point that the member mentions around about skills. At the moment, the capacity assessment that's being made is that there are sufficient assessors in that regard, but it's something we continue to keep close monitoring and will continue to discuss with other UK Government colleagues.
Willie Rennie, to be followed by Emma Roddick.
I'm afraid the Minister isn't inspiring confidence. He doesn't seem to be answering many of our questions this afternoon. Can he help me understand? I thought we would have known by now which buildings across Scotland were potentially at risk. Why are we now, only now, doing a single open call? Why could that have not been done last year, or the year before, or the year before that, or even the year before that? Why is this taking so long?
Minister.
Can I thank the member for that question? I think I've appeared in the Chamber before and said, you know, the pace should have been quicker. In terms of that, the very purpose of today is quickening that purpose. And again, one of the key things I think was around about the pilot model and what we learned from that pilot model. Now, one of the key things I think we're moving on now is obviously the grant funding model, which we think will quicken the pace around about that particular point. I think there are a few things that's been mentioned since. We've now got the statutory single building assessment, which is backed up by the robust standards that I've talked about. We've now created the legislative framework through the cladding bill in that particular point. We have gone out, as I said, and spoken to COSLA in that particular point in terms of the support for the approach that we've taken. I held a meeting with a committee, I think it was the Wellbeing Committee in that particular regard, speaking to councillors who are responsible for building safety in that particular point, and the approach was supported at that particular time. So the purpose of today, as I said, was to quicken the pace and also looking at how we widen that pace as well. And that's been supported by COSLA and the approach we have with COSLA, and we're working very closely with the regulator in terms of RSLs.
Roddick, to be followed by Sandesh Gulhani.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm glad to hear the Minister discuss the need to strengthen building standards and safety. I've been concerned by recent reports that the UK Government is looking to cut red tape to push development through the planning system faster. The tragedy at Grenfell and the recent report reminds us that the planning system and building standards are our opportunity to get things right before they can go wrong. So does the Minister agree that the most important aspect of house building is providing people with a safe and secure place to live?
Minister.
Yeah, can I thank the member for her question, and I think I've kind of highlighted it in responses, and also the work that's been going on since the fire. And of course, one of the main aims of the Building Scotland Act 2003 is on the health and safety of building. I think the response that I mentioned before to the Grenfell Tower Inquiry has been able to strengthen building standards since then, make regulations more effective and deliver safer buildings. Changes to fire safety standards have also been made in the past around about the safety of buildings by requiring the use of non-combustible cladding, improving escape provision and introducing automatic fire suppression. A new building standards compliance plan approach is being developed under the direction of the Building Standards Futures Board, and it's at an early adopter stage. Now, to support local authority verifiers, and a point I think Mr Leonard made, to fulfil the role and delivery, building warrant fees are currently being increased to a 3-year model. Our planning system has statutory structure that ensures planning decisions are made following a thorough assessment of the development plan and all material considerations. Where permitted development rights may also be involved, so removing the need for planning applications of specified development, these rights are carefully created to ensure the potential impacts are properly assessed. So coming back to the point that the member mentioned, we have taken considerable work since the fire. We continue to do so and will continue to do so to work on the recommendations of the inquiry going forward.
Sandish Gulhani, to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Implementation of the cladding remediation programme has been plagued by shifting criteria, long wait and a lack of clarity. A classic example of this concerns my Glasgow constituent, Park Property Management. For affected property owners, every delay means more uncertainty, more financial strain and more stress. And this statement does not provide a clear timeline, but another drawn-out process, leaving residents trapped in uncertainty and fear. So when, and a timescale please, when will my constituents see action?
Minister.
As Mr Gahani knows, that we've been engaging in this particular discussion around about his constituents, and he knows that individual cases are different in terms of single building assessments and also in terms of remediation works that are carried out. And I will continue to engage with Mr Gahani on that particular stage. Coming back again to the point of making the statement today, the point was, as I said, to try and quicken the pace, which I think we will through this process, the single open call process, and also through the remediation part of this going forward. As I said, we've taken action on the single building assessment and also the Cladding Act as well, which has pushed us towards it. I'll continue to engage with Mr Gulhani on that particular point. I can't give specifics in terms of where the single building assessment is, what is highlighted in the remediation work that's carried out, but what I can give Mr Gulhani the assurance is I will continue to engage with him on that particular issue with his constituents.
Rona Mackay, to be followed by Stephen Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government has taken a firm but fair approach to ensure developers uphold their responsibilities in cladding remediation. So can the Minister outline how interventions like the Scottish Safer Buildings Accord and the upcoming Responsible Developer Scheme ensure developers are incentivised to work with and not against the Scottish Government in making our buildings safer?
Minister.
Can I thank the member for her question? I think one of the key things all the way through this process has been the partnership approach we've taken with developers, the partnership approach we are committing to in terms of local authorities and also working with RSLs. So coming back to the specific point that she mentions, developers agreeing and signing a legally binding developer remediation contract will be a positive step by ensuring the safety of homeowners and residents in multi-residential properties with unsafe cladding. We've made significant progress in key principles with the developer remediation contract negotiations, which again are continuing in a good vein with the developers. We continue to work constructively with developers who are taking steps to assess or remediate buildings of which we are a developer. This will include considering proposals for a responsible developer scheme.
Stephen Kerr, to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was in London 8 years ago come June and won't forget the feelings but also the very sensation of the smell that arose because of the terrible tragedy at Grenfell. This has really not been the Minister's finest hour by a very long way, because if I understand what he has told us this afternoon in a statement that he has asked for, he can't tell us how many high-rise buildings need to be remediated. He can't tell us how many are going to be remediated by the end of this parliamentary session. He can't tell us how much money of the £97.1 million that the Scottish Government receives from the UK Government for cladding remediation has been spent. Is he not ashamed and embarrassed not to know such basic information and appear before this Parliament?
Minister.
Again, coming back to the point I've mentioned on a few particular points, if I'm expected to highlight what buildings will be completed without some of these buildings going through the single building assessment process and what remediation contract comes out in terms of that, I think is a bit unfair on that particular point. We'll continue to work on quickening the pace which I've mentioned, which I'm confident we will do that. In terms of the funding, there's over £50 million being set aside on that particular point, and we publish a quarterly review how much is actually spent on that particular point. So to come and ask me to say what buildings will be renovated by a certain point in a certain year, I think is unfair. I'm happy to keep Mr Kerr on that particular point. As I said, I'm coming back to the point you've mentioned, Mr Kerr. A single building assessment process takes a different period of time depending where the building is. The remediation contract and the work that's required also takes a different period of time in that regard. I'm happy to keep him up to date in regards to the buildings that are remediated. I've made the statement in terms of what we're currently going through in terms of the single building assessment process. But as I said, coming back to the statement today, the whole purpose of this is to quicken up the pace and also widen the breadth of work that we're undertaking on that particular point.
And Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Minister, I think I heard you say that from June, social landlords will be able to apply for funds in relation to remediation for cladding, which would be welcome. That would be important to my constituents because I've got issues in my constituency. Often there will be disputes between developers, architects and owners who can be social landlords. Will that be a barrier to social landlords applying for remediation funding from June onwards?
Mr.
Yeah, I think it's a very important point Mr Doris makes, and I think I'm aware of the Housing Association that he refers to in that particular point, and we're continuing to work with them on that particular point. I think we mentioned around about the open call being made available for those that are already in purpose just now. I think one of the key things is ensuring that we move forward on that. I mentioned about the ability to pay for RSLs and housing associations on that particular point, which I think is very relevant. In terms of the particular points that he mentions, cladding officials will continue to work with the factors, the residents and developers and the housing association itself on that particular point going forward. And that principle, I think, could be shared across any RSL or local authority in that particular point.
Thank you. That concludes the ministerial statement. I will allow a moment or two for front benches to organise before we move on to the next item of business.